Welcome to the lecture over natural selection. We're going to focus today only on Darwin's theory of natural selection and looking at a couple of different aspects within his theory and things that drive his theory in order to fully understand natural selection. We learned last week that over time, species that are best suited for their environment will survive and pass those beneficial traits to their offspring. That is what Darwin coined as his theory of natural selection. It happens over time, so it's over many generations, hundreds and thousands of years, and that the best suited traits are the ones that are going to survive because they're best suited for their environment, and if they survive, then they can pass those traits to their offspring. There are different factors that affect or drive natural selection. One of them is survival of the fittest. Second is overproduction of offspring, genetic variation, adaptation, selection, and descent with modification. And we're going to talk about each of these things today. So first, survival of the fittest. Fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. So it's the result of the adaptations, physical or behavioral, that the organism has that allows it to survive in its environment. So whether it has good adaptations, that way it could survive in its environment, means it has good fitness. But if it has bad adaptations, things that are not helping it survive, then it's going to have bad fitness. We know that adaptations are inherited characteristics that increase the organism's chance for survival. So it just allows them to survive better in their environment. And the relevance of this is only the fittest organisms end up surviving to pass on their traits. The ones that are not fit are not going to pass on their traits because they're not going to get to be able to survive to reproduce. And because the organisms that have those adaptations are the ones that survive, they're the ones that are able to reproduce and cause the population to change over time because those are the traits that are getting passed down in the population. But here's the key. If an organism has high fitness in one area, it does not mean that they're going to have high fitness in another environment. For example, a polar bear in the Arctic has really high fitness with its adaptations. It has a ton of blubber, it has a ton of hair. But if its environment would change and it would end up having the climate that we have here in Texas, where it's hot most of the year, it would not have the highest fitness. It might overheat. It's not going to be able to survive as well as other organisms, and so it's not going to have high fitness in that environment. So the environment is key and important here. Here are some other factors that drive natural selection. One is overproduction of offspring. And that's when a plant or an animal reproduces, it creates many more offspring than the environment can support. So an example is fish laying millions of eggs at one time, but only a fraction of them are going to survive. Do you remember Finding Nemo, where the mom ended up giving a ton of eggs, but then the shark came and ate most of them? That's because they have to do, for those organisms, overproduction of offspring in order to ensure that a fraction of those organisms are going to survive, because either they're being eaten by predation or they are not as likely to survive. The next one is genetic variation, and that's within a species there are variations that are due to mutations. Some are heritable that can be passed down. And so those mutations are the change in DNA, and that has a reason to drive evolution. Next is adaptation. This is a mutation that makes an individual better able to survive, gives it an advantage in its environment. So this bug here has the adaptation where it looks like a leaf, and so it can camouflage itself, gives it an advantage if it's living in a leafy area. Next is selection. This is individual organisms with a particular adaptation to survive long enough to reproduce. And so that means that the next generation is going to have the traits that were able to survive because those are the ones that were able to reproduce. So for example, if this bunny rabbit was here in the snow, it would most likely be eaten by predators because it sticks out like a sore thumb. And so if they end up being eaten by those predators, then they're not going to be able to reproduce to end up creating more bunnies with that fur color. But here, this bunny over here is well suited for its environment. It can blend into the grass and trees around them, and so they're not as likely to be eaten by predators. And so this organism is going to have better selection to reproduce and pass his traits down in his population. Next thing here is descent with modification, and that is a theory that all species come from common ancestors. And so he believes that they look different from their ancestors because over a long period of time, natural selection produces organisms that have different structures, meaning they descended with modification. So over time, they ended up with those mutations in their populations, and the ones that had the advantageous adaptations in their environment are the ones to survive, and then you end up seeing a variety of different traits within that population. And the relevance of this for him is that it links all organisms on Earth to a single tree of life, known as common descent. So here's an example that he used, Darwin used with the finches, that one of the ancestors came from the mainland of South America to the Galapagos, and then over time you see all of these mutations occur within their offspring, which became advantageous in some of the islands, and so they were able to reproduce on those islands and end up keeping those traits within the population. And so once again, all of those different traits he believes came from one single common ancestor. Next, the rate of evolution is driven by two things. First, it's driven by how quickly organisms can reproduce. If it reproduces more quickly, then it's more advantageous to survive because you can create more offspring in a shorter period of time. While an example is fruit flies, they can reproduce in 2 days. So they can create a ton of offspring in a small period of time. But humans, it takes 9 months in order for us to reproduce, because it takes 9 months in the womb for the baby. And so how quickly they can reproduce is going to affect the rate of evolution or the change in that species that we see. Next is how many offspring they produce every time. The more offspring they produce, the more ability for mutations or genetic variation, and so you can see more changes within that population over time. Here are just some important vocabulary for you guys. First is population, which is a group of individuals of the same species that interbreed. So in order for us to term it a population, they have to be the same species and they breed with one another. The next term we're going to learn is gene pool, and this is that all genes of the same members of a particular population. So all of the alleles within that population. So all the different variations would be called a gene pool. Next we have genetic variation, which is the difference in the DNA sequences between individuals within a population. And so this is the variation of those genes within a population. There are 3 main sources of genetic variation within a population. First is mutations. Mutations change the sequence of the DNA. If it's a beneficial mutation, then the trait's going to increase in the population. If it's not beneficial, then it won't show up as prevalent. So this is just the change in DNA that we learned last semester. If you end up changing the DNA, you can change the gene, which will change the trait. If you change the trait, if it's advantageous, you can end up seeing it in the population over time, because those are the organisms that will be able to reproduce and pass down their traits. The next source of genetic variation, or how we see different varieties in our genes, is recombination. Recombination is genes combining in new ways during the production of gametes and crossing over. So if you remember meiosis, there's the chromosomes in prophase 1, they lined up together and they have the opportunity to go through crossing over, which can switch different genes on those homologous chromosomes, and so that increases genetic variation from recombination. The last thing is gene flow, and this is when you transfer genes between different populations. And so an example would be people moving from one country to another, or the migration of animals from another population. And so if you think about these organisms here, they're going to have different DNA because they came from a different area. When they came in, they ended up introducing that DNA to the population because they ended up starting to breed with one another, and so you see an introduction of new genes within the population. So we know that evolution by natural selection acts on entire populations, not just individuals. So you're not going to just see this in one individual organism. It has to happen on entire populations over time. And it never acts directly on genes. The entire organism survives to reproduce, or they die and do not reproduce. It's just the fact that whether that trait is more advantageous so that they can reproduce and create children, or if it's not advantageous, then they're not going to reproduce and they're not going to pass on those genes. There are different types of natural selection, and we're going to talk about those 3 types really quickly. First, we have directional selection, and these are individuals that are just at one end of a curve having higher fitness. So an example would be anteaters with long tongues have better ability to capture ants, and so the frequency of that trait is going to end up moving towards that one end because those organisms are going to survive. And so if this anteater has longer tongue, it's going to be able to eat more, which means it's going to have a better ability to survive and reproduce. And so you will see a curve end up moving towards the right in one direction from the original to the population having more of that trait. The next type is stabilizing selection, and that means that the individuals in the center of the curve have higher fitness. And so an example of that is the human baby weight at birth, the ones in the center having a more consistent weight there at birth. They're more likely to survive compared to individuals that are either obese or underweight at birth. And so you see an end up stabilizing selection where you have a curve end up focusing mainly on the middle because those are the ones that survive and can reproduce. And the last one here is disruptive selection. And this means that the upper and lower ends of the curve have higher fitness, but the ones in the middle do not. So an example here is large and small seeds are common, and the bird beaks are either large or small. And so you end up seeing that the ones on the ends here that have either really small beaks or really large beaks are the ones that are more advantageous. So you end up seeing a change here to have those be the ones that are more prevalent in the population because those ones are more likely to survive. So let's try to figure out which of these natural selections is on display. So this is the original curve here in the dotted lines, and now we see that it's focusing in the center there. What type of selection is that? That would be stabilizing because it's staying in the center. What about this one? Here's the regular curve, and now we end up with a curve like this. That would be an example of disruptive. And the last one here, the original curve, it moves to the right. That would be directional selection. And the last thing we're going to talk about are patterns of evolution today. And this is a process of 2 or more related species becoming more and more dissimilar over time. And so an example is a red fox and a kit fox. The red fox lives in a forest where the red color blends in with the trees, while the kit fox lives in deserts where the light brown color blends in with the sandy environment. And the more that they end up living in those areas and reproducing, they're going to end up becoming more different over time with those adaptations. Even though they were similar with their common ancestors, they've adapted to 2 different environments, causing them to diverge. And so we call this divergent evolution, where they're becoming more dissimilar over time. The next type is convergent evolution. This is where 2 unrelated species become more similar as they adapt to the same type of environment. So we're talking about 2 totally different species here. So my example here is I have a penguin and I have a whale. They're not similar species. This is a bird and this is a mammal here. And so they both have similar structures. They have their fins here that help them swim, but they're completely unrelated. But they are becoming more similar over time based on the environment that they live in. And so you'll see convergent evolution coming together. Coevolution is the process by which 2 species evolve in response to changes in each other. There's 2 different types. Cooperative coevolution means that they're working together in symbiotic relationships, while opposition coevolution is where they're camouflaging and using other defense mechanisms. The last one here is genetic equilibrium or stasis, and this is a situation in which the allele frequencies in a population remain constant. You're not seeing any change in that population over time. And these are the conditions that are required to maintain that equilibrium. They need to have random mating, population must be very large, they can't be moving around in or out of the population, they can't be mutations or natural selection occurring. And so if they're in stasis, When all five are met, evolution will not occur.